Hello and welcome to this OpenSensors webinar where we'll be exploring the world of work post-pandemic. This is the first in a three-part series where we'll be exploring how the world of work is about to change, what the implications are, the practical considerations of those changes, and finally, the role of data. Now, this is episode 1, so this is our introduction to the topic where we look at the rise of hybrid working in general. And my name is Chris Moriarty, and I'll be your host for this series, and it's my job to take us through each of those topics. Now, I've been around the world of workplace now for almost a decade, and I've never seen the conversation at a national level like this before. So it's exciting times, and I think it's fairly accepted that there are going to be some changes in the way that we work. So whether that's organizations looking to remain agile as they look at their workplaces. Now, that could be driven by risk management, so trying to mitigate against future pandemics or lockdowns, changing behaviours of employees, or changing expectations of employees. But needless to say, amongst all of that, the world of work and the workplaces that support them are about to change. Now, that's probably a good thing. When you consider the number of studies that we've seen that shows how the world of work impacts society. Now, whether that's at an organizational level with countless studies showing how productivity is inhibited by some of our workplaces, or at a human level where we look at the role of well-being and its relationship to the work we do. So first up, we've got Dan Gardner, who's the Associate Director and Senior Workplace Strategist at KKS Saville. And he's been working with a number of organizations looking at the challenges and how that changes their workplace approach. So he'll be able to give us some insight from them. We have Megan Phillips, who's the Director of Organizational Development at Clear Channel International, as well as being the Head of Organizational Development and Business Transformation at PTHR, who are a consultancy that advise organizations on creating workplaces that enable people to flourish. So that we've got our people angle. And then finally, we've got Chris Kane, who's a renowned workplace thinker, a speaker, an author, with his book, Where's My Office, which looks at reimagining workplace for the 21st century. And Chris, I want to start with you because you and I spent some time together when you were writing your book. And, we were talking about the world of workplace and the changes and all the rest of it. And I was, when we were preparing for this webinar, I was sort of thinking back, if only we had known what was about to come. And perhaps you did, because the title of your book landed at the best possible time, I think, as organizations had to shift everyone out of their buildings. But looking back pre-pandemic, do you think some of the changes that we're talking about and some of the changes that organizations are talking about are fundamentally different approaches than what we had pre-pandemic? Or do you think it's just accelerated some of the things that you were starting to see the world of workplace start to adopt?
Wow. I think you're the master of the understatement, really. I think in general, what we all have to accept is that we're all witnessing some existential shocks taking place to our entire system of not only the workplace, but of living, of learning and working generally. And I think, you can choose to either view it as a challenge or as a huge opportunity, because we're living through a massive shift from fixed to fluid, which some companies did recognize pre-COVID. But there's a massive rethink underway by both the C-suite and by workers, not only in this country, but right across the globe. And they're asking 3 key questions. What is office work really all about? How will office workers want to work in the years ahead? And where is office work done? And if we don't accept that these 3 factors are interdependent, then we risk moving into the future sideways by continuing to use 20th century thinking to solve, 21st century problems. Because as you rightly say, for the last 20 years, there's been a huge shift in so many things. And some companies have recognized them and embraced different ways of working, from activity-based working, whatever. But there were 6 key things that happened over the last 15, 20 years, brought about by the arrival of the smart device, and by a whole cohort of other more people-related issues, which I'm sure Megan will highlight. But we've moved from analog to digital. We've moved from process work to knowledge work. We've come out of our silos into a more systems network way of operating. We certainly moved from being static to fluid, and we've been moved to being much more porous than the closed world of the past. And then in the context of the built environment, we are certainly moving irreversibly from a fixed own mindset to an on-demand subscribed world. So if you look at all of that, we are on the cusp of, I think, a renaissance of the workplace. And I think, it's a huge opportunity. We shouldn't look at it as a challenge, but we should think about this holistically, and we should think about people and place rather than the other way around.
So, Dan, are organizations thinking about this holistically? Because you'll be, Chris is talking about this, organizations are asking themselves quite fundamental changes, about changes about purpose of spaces, about, how they offer those spaces up to their employees. And it kind of strikes me that I guess pre-pandemic, the people coming to you would have been coming to you for a very specific, maybe predictable reason, like there's a lease event coming up or they're expanding, so they could sort of plan in advance. They knew that change was coming, but this is kind of turned it on its head. And I guess the first tranche of clients might have been, well, we were going to make this change anyway, let's think about it slightly differently. But there will slowly but surely be organizations coming to you now going, we didn't even know we had to make this change, but we're going to have to make some change. So are you seeing them asking slightly different questions than they were before?
Yeah, I think so. Like I say, most previous projects were kickstarted from a lease end, a lease break, etc. But now, firms are coming to us and looking at the big picture. So whole portfolio reviews, like they may even only have one lease break, but they're looking at the whole thing. So there's a consistency of product throughout the whole office portfolio. So we're making them consistent, more people friendly, applying all the well-being and the enriched environments that you actually need to have a consistent level across all your office portfolio really now. So it's really opened up our world. It's changed the way we work and changed our customers actually, as well as what our customers are now asking for.
Is that because I wonder as well whether that the way you're describing it there almost feels like a great opportunity, because a lot of people that have been in and around this space for a number of years are sort of always been advocates of some of the stuff that you've discussed. And, I'm sure, the work that you guys do is amazing, but, organizations still haven't quite really embraced this kind of broad idea, holistic idea of office space, of workspace. And do you find now that you're pushing against a bit more of an open door now when you're talking to clients, because their kind of whole association with workplaces is kind of been turned on its head?
Yeah, totally. So certainly the door is wide open, and your CEOs and CFOs are aware of how good they have to make their office space to pull people in and to keep hold of their talents, basically. Yeah. And obviously, I'm sure Megan's going to speak about that in terms of where is your workforce from now? Why are they living within an hour of the office, wherever that is now, and what is the office really?
And so, Megan, how have you seen that talent conversation change post-pandemic? And how, I guess what I'm really interested in, I was speaking to a recruiter several months ago, and they were saying that when they were recruiting in the past, someone might mention, oh, is there any flexible working available? And now she's saying to me that it's the first thing that people talk about. How often am I expected to be in the office? So have you seen the way that organizations are recruiting change because of the pandemic, but also the role of the physical workspace as a part of that conversation has become more prominent?
Within the talent space, we are absolutely seeing people start to ask that immediate question, and actually almost an expectation that is there. One of the things I think I've experienced with a number of organizations we've been working with is trying to nail what the message is and not seeing it as an experiment, because ultimately expectations have absolutely changed. And when people talk about hybrid, I think there's a real mixed understanding of what that actually means for the individual. But at PTHR, we talk a huge amount about purpose at work and finding self-managed systems that can really sort of shift the psychological contract. And I think if you can find a way of working in the environment, regardless of whether it's at home or at work, that gives people that sense of community and connection in a very self-managed and empowering way, then actually it doesn't really matter where they are, because the answer should be you work where and as you need to do what you need to do, which is the approach we've actually also taken at Clear Channel, which is very much a values-based approach to, work can be done anywhere, and we don't expect it to, or at any time, and we don't expect it to need to be on the organization's terms. That said, I would say my experience so far with working with execs, and I wonder whether Chris alluded to this as well, is sometimes the expectation of what our CEOs are saying is different to what the workforce need is saying, and trying to strike the right balance of trust and accountability and empowerment to the workforce has been one of the major challenges. But absolutely, in this new sort of war for talent, it's the first expectation. And I've had people say to me, I'd rather have 10 grand less than have to come into the office every day. And I think it is also having an impact on different brands. So I'm sure many people have seen the sort of Grant Thornton, bank. Why can't I remember their names? Goldman Sachs, that's it, of course. Yeah. Goldman Sachs take, which is you're coming into the office. But sort of my reflection back to our CEO at Clear Channel was, but William, we don't have that brand. We don't have the Goldman Sachs brand that means they can ask that of us. And actually, we need to think about how we build our brand in a different way that's more empowering for our people. So, yeah.
That's been one of the interesting things to watch during this whole debate, which is kind of one end of the spectrum. You'll have Goldman Sachs CEO saying this is I forget the words he used, but he was quite damning about the whole thing, and said, I demand you coming back into the office. However, then you see other news stories about their workplace culture generally, which doesn't strike me as being the most relaxing of environments to be in. I can't imagine that they kind of have a nurturing environment. It's just an external view. That's all. But on the other hand, then you had people like Spotify and Shopify and other technology firms with FY at the end of their name, probably sort of saying, look, work from wherever you want. And I think, for the ordinary organizations in between, that's been quite a confusing landscape to navigate. And you touching on culture there, I think it's really interesting, because that's been one of the things that people are concerned about. Is that, you've got organizations talking to you that say, well, that's the kind of the reason we want to drag people in, because this nebulous thing called culture feels even more nebulous when everyone's everywhere and I can't actually see people and hear stuff and pick up on vibes. So are you finding that that's really this kind of pivot point with this whole debate?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's some of the reason why, I think a lot of people pre-pandemic would say that a lot of their cultural or ritual, and at PTHR we talk a lot about the sort of rituals, so that the known things in the organization that happen on a regular basis, like, as an example, Pizza Friday in the office, that becomes ritualistic, that brings that community and connection together. And it's how you start to do that in a different way, because if your employees don't need or want that from the organization anymore, they're looking for community from a different sense of connection, then how can you recreate that in a different way and re-ritualize what the organization looks like? And I think when you've been so used to a office first mentality, actually talking about hybrid by design, which you think about organization design and the operating model that the organization has, you almost need to look at every single touch point that has been designed in such a way that says office first. Sometimes home is non-existent, and sometimes home is in part existent, but on the fly when you fancy it. And so for PTHR, it's really, like what Chris said, a total infrastructure operating model, people, place, and really thinking about process as well. So how does the systems and infrastructure really enable a hybrid environment rather than a office one, which by proxy will drive culture, because it's driven from a sense of purposeful and meaningful way of doing things. And they're the kind of conversations we're having with our clients at the moment, which is, how do you really connect back to what your purpose is, and how does that working model enable that? At PTHR, we are a totally self-managed, totally remote workforce across completely different geographies. I have never met 90% of my colleagues there, and we do that connecting to a whole operating model that drives that, which I can talk about for hours if you like. But yeah, it can be done. I think it's looking at the whole system.
So you mentioned people, place, process, which, Chris, you and I were saying those three words to each other. Well, you were telling me those three words back in 2015, where I first got introduced to the world of workplace leadership and management and all the rest of it. Now, something that Megan's talked on there, what I'm hearing is that we're talking about the connection between the space that an organization has and its culture and therefore, its people. And that's something that's been around. The idea has been around for a long time. You and I were involved in a project that tried to force HR and FM practitioners into the same room digitally, which called the Workplace Conversation, which was a
force, surely not.
Well, yeah, exactly. So we've been conspiring for a number of years now. But do you think, looking back at that experience, which I think was a positive one in a step along a series of steps, but looking back, it was far from what it needed to be. But do you think that this whole episode has allowed organizations to look at the interconnection between space and culture, and for people listening who are in organizations, and for organizations like Dan's that are trying to show the importance of workplace, this is a positive thing that we need to take advantage of, right?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I agree with everything that Megan has talked about in terms of the shift to a greater focus on purpose type organizations rather than the traditional one. But I was serious when I said that we're in danger of trying to move into the new future sideways, because even the word hybrid denotes that it's a mix between two fixed bookends, the office and the home. And for many people, working at home is just not an option. And I think we have to go beyond hybrid and think really holistically. Now, that is bad news for those of us who come from the world of space, where the office has been long regarded as a fixed entity, which is a huge investment for many people. It's made a lot of money for a lot of other folk, and it's provided a lot of jobs for a lot of other folk. But the reality is we're in a new world, and the new world of work will be mixed between physical and cyber, not online, but cyber. And I think hybrid, for want of a better label at the moment, although it's inadequate, of some sort will be the mainstream within a very short order. You mentioned about the technology guys and the bank guys. Why is it the media always focus on those two? Bearing in mind that manufacturing and most of British business is made up of SMEs, but they too are shifting towards thinking very differently. I've been working with two major manufacturing companies in the last few weeks, both of whom are exploring how to deal with a new working world for their office workers. So, and at the top of their agenda is a healthy and environmentally sustainable workplace. And they've all recognized that the economic reality of the world is power is shifted to the worker, and the worker now realizes they have a new power in terms of choice. Enterprises are all moving rapidly to a portfolio of places, some owned, some rented, some just in time, some subscribed, and it's going to be split between physical and cyber, where people can move seamlessly between the two. And the other big thing that's happening across businesses in the last couple of weeks, there's now a general consensus that there's no right answer. There's no precedents, there's no playbooks, and the one size fits all management methodology of the 20th century just won't cut it. And so everything is going to be driven by agility and resilience. So for the real estate sector, it's about getting real to the new reality and adopting at scale space as a service, and getting real about the fact that we have to get to net zero carbon very quickly, because the clock is ticking on that. So you have this convergence of three major vectors of change: the implications of the pandemic, climate change, and the thing that's been happening for 20 years, which is digital transformation. And all of those are forcing us into a very, very different world, in my humble opinion.
And it's, I guess, something for another time, but it's even more interesting when you see what Facebook have announced today with their new brand and augmented reality, and they've talked a little bit about how we work in that and virtual workspaces and stuff.
Will Facebook exist in 5 years' time? Will the worlds of corporate real estate, HR, and IT as support functions as we know them today exist within 3 to 5 years' time? There's a question back for you, Chris.
Hey, I don't need to answer questions here. I get to ask them. I get to ask
oh,
them.
kicking for touches ever.
Exactly. So Dan, Chris mentioned in there about a little bit about how the industry is going to have to adapt and stuff, and how some organizations are going to have to sort of change their thinking and get away from this, as he described, this kind of bookended bit. Now, as someone who has one of those jobs in that sector, and I could see you sort of nodding along there whilst Chris was talking. Have you seen, I guess the two bits that I'm curious about. The first thing is some of those trends that Chris is talking about converging about future of work, digitisation and sustainability, climate change. Have you seen that being more of a driver in your conversations, even pre-pandemic, I guess, to an extent, but now? And also, I'm just interested as well, this idea about, you know, I've talked about it in other places where the idea that workplace strategy is not about the strategy that you have for the space that people work in that you own. It's more about the experience they have across a range of spaces. And are you starting to, or do you see a future where you guys are getting involved in that workplace experience outside of the shell that you've been commissioned to look at, and just thinking about, actually, we want people to come through this space as much as be in it? So two very big questions, I realise as well. I have a habit of doing that, so sorry.
Yeah, on the first one about, like you say, the hot topics, climate, CO2, etc., etc. Yes, it's always on everyone's agenda when they come to design office space, but that agenda is just gigantic. There are so many boxes you need to tick. Yeah. Not that it's just a box ticking exercise. It is for some companies. Others, they really want to push forward and be greener, etc. But there's so many things you have to think about as a company when it comes to, not just, like I say, it's no longer just the design of an office anymore. It's how are all your staff working? Where are they working? What have they got to work with? And just that whole very, very long list. So yes, it is on everyone's agenda, but so are lots of other things as well. And I think unless you're a company that is well known for choosing one and going down that line and being the, say, greenest company out there, it's I can imagine it's very hard for companies to be the best at everything and be the most responsible company they can be. And then coming back to, like you say, the design of that office and its expansion, we haven't yet, for instance, been asked by a company to both design their office and everyone's home office, which would be that ultimate consistency. Haven't yet. It'd be nice to. Lovely if you said, oh, please go and design our 100 staff's home office rooms as well as our actual office. Would be good. I mean, we do also design home stuff as well, so we have to think about how we can get spaces to work into people's homes already, or we have to really emphasize that it's an important part of a household now to have the space to work as well. But yeah, in terms of the actual then design of the office, it's getting to the point now where if you're asking yourself, what's my reason for going into the office? Because at home, my home is enriched with my things, I can have my music on. It's my decoration, it's my furniture, my tech's better. So the majority, I'd say, of offices really have a lot to catch up with in order for their staff to be in there and think, oh, it was actually worthwhile me being in here today, rather than get into an office and be like, oh, I can't print anything, or I can't connect to a screen, oh, it's too loud. So there's a lot of hurdles to get through before the office is as efficient as some people's homes may be. And as Chris said, not everyone has space to work at home, so they have to be in the office, and therefore it can't all be just about, collaboration spaces. You have to supply the right space for people to concentrate, for those who aren't fortunate enough to have a room with a drum kit in at home as well.
Well, it's an interesting point there you talked about in terms of this space is enriched with my things, right? Because we touched earlier on about pre-pandemic trends and stuff like that, and one of them would have been don't have your things on the desk, right? You've got to be agile, you got to move around, you got to use multiple spaces. And where I've done some work in the past, it's people do like to put their picture of their kids on their desk and all that, but it kind of goes against a lot of the ABW and modern work practices. And what we're saying now is actually people going, that's not the only sole reason, but that is one of the attractions of working from home, is my stuff is here and I'm not being disturbed by people. And I have got, you know, childish toys in the background that just make me feel a bit more like this is my space. So it's a bit, you know, how do we just accept that there's two versions of a workspace, that, you know, at home that's where it's your space and here this is our space, and trying to find a blend between the two? Is that the only approach? But before they start commissioning you, I mean, if you want to design my office, that would be great, Dan, and I'd love that. But, you know, before we get to that point, do we just have to accept that those are the sort of two modes, I guess, which is your environment and our environment, I guess?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, in terms of personalization points within an office space, yes, it has moved away from that's my desk, this is my stuff on it, and we now try to design office spaces to get, you know, engage with the people who use them, to make this is my office, this is where I work, meaning the whole office, and then maybe your immediate team, and within that space you can personalize to a degree, make it feel like it's your team identity, etc. But yeah, I'm always a bit of a stickler for when people say, where do I put the photos of my children? I just think you obviously don't spend enough time at home.
Yeah, put it on the inside of your locker. That's normally the answer. But it's, so what we're touching on, and it tends to be the case with when we talk about space, is that we actually end up talking about culture a lot more because of how important it is. And Megan, I'm going to come to you next, and then Chris, I saw you shaking your head at one point, and I want to come and sort of poke around and see why you were shaking your head. Well, you were, by the way, Dan, he was shaking his head when I was speaking, so it's clearly something I said that he disagreed with. But Megan, in terms of culture, there's two things. One that Dan's mentioned, one that's come in with the questions here, is that the role you've talked about, actually we don't necessarily need to be in the same space to develop this culture, but actually what Dan's talking about there is talking about this is our office, and that sort of sense of belonging that's strengthened by being in the same location as people. And I don't think there's much doubt with that. If you look at, you know, the football crowds, you know, there's something tribal about being all in the one place, all in the same colors, all behind the same objectives. So, you know, how do we sort of balance that out? And also, someone says actually question whether things like corporate culture are important, particularly to new generations that are coming through that are a bit more fleeting with their employment, whereas, you know, the kind of 40, you know, we've been saying this for a long while now, the sort of 40-year career in the one organization is long gone, but has that time shortened? And therefore, does things like corporate culture at a very deep level, are they less important now because people are going to kind of bit more fluid, a bit more transitory? I think that's the word.
Something like that.
Transient, that's the word. whatever the Y end of that word is. But do you see what I mean? So
yeah,
how important is the space on culture, and how important is culture full stop?
I think to come to space, Dan used the word identity, and I think that's what hit the nail on the head. Is if the office environment physically gives a sense of identity, then absolutely that's driving a sense of belonging. But you can do that in a completely remote way, and and I actually really hate the word hybrid, but let's go with hybrid way, by creating a sense of community and social bond that builds that over time. And you can do that with people in the office and at home and in a connected way. But that requires, as I said before, and I feel like I'm repeating myself to a certain extent, individuals to feel like they are self-managed and empowered to do it. So how do you create really autonomous systems in the organization? How do you create really free and open communication in the organization that drives that continued sense of identity? And how do you really then kind of decentralize authority in a formal and systematic way so that it starts to allow people to feel a connection wherever they are? And you use the analogy of football stadiums, which actually is close to my heart, because I wrote a blog post on it recently about why do football fans stay true to a football team for their whole life, and people don't in organizations. What is it that's driving that? And I wouldn't argue that it's because they go to the stadium and feel the sense of, wow, yeah, they do it because of everything else. And the trust in the team and the trust in the manager, or the lack of trust in a manager, if you're like my father who supports Manchester United. But I think that is deeply important, that there's a sense of trust, connection and belonging. And you can do that regardless of whether you're in or out of an office, but it's how you look at the full system and allow people to have the autonomy to be able to connect and do that. I probably am not the best person to ask about my subjective view, because personally I don't feel any sense of identity to my office, because I was literally in it for about 2 months before I ended up being remote. But I still feel a sense of connection to something, and that's been built through all of the other parts of the system that have enabled me to feel it. And ultimately what it really comes back to is, what's your individual reason for being, and does that connect to the organizations? And if you gain that, then ultimately the office thing over here is fairly unimportant to creating culture. So to come into your other question, does culture exist, or does it need to exist?
So the question is more about like looking at generations, which is always a bit of a dangerous game to play when you look at generations and try and do a nice sweeping generalization of them. But generally speaking, are people coming into the workforce as concerned with something like culture as, you know, the several generations prior, where, you know, the big brands and the big employers had a real draw, but now, you know, whether it's because everything's more digital and easy, and transient was the word I was looking for, by the way. Transient. That's the one.
So that's the word. I think people are, to go back to our conversation earlier on sustainability, I think people are, I wouldn't say it's generational. I think there is a shift in the world. You know, what's going on in Glasgow this weekend is a huge symbol of what we are looking for in the world, and what COVID has really driven us to start really questioning, you know, why are we here, kind of thing. It was very existential in some respects. And I think as an organization, that's what people are, or certainly that's what I'm seeing in my world, is people are looking for connection and belonging and purpose that is doing good in the world in some way, and organizations need to be able to tell their story. So I think a very important part of the new hybrid world is organizations really being able to nail the narrative and the story about why they're here and what they're doing, and then be able to back that up in the operating model around that being lived and breathed in every single moment, whether that is in an office, at home, on the moon. So for me, that is the most important thing. So I don't think anyone would ever say, you know, as human beings, we look for a sense of connection to other people. So for me, that's what culture is all about. Yeah. And if you can nail that as an organization, then you're likely to make people want to stay because they feel like they belong. You know, we started in tribal communities as cavemen, and we haven't really progressed that much evolutionary to get there. So for me, that's what is the most important thing towards culture. And my personal argument is, what we say about Generation Z now is probably what we were saying, just in a slightly different way 20 years ago. So I would argue it's not that different. But
yeah, a lot of the time when we say about generations, we just mean young people, don't we? Like people younger than me, the next lot of young-uns coming through.
Yeah. There is a different social contract at work, so it isn't the job for life, and I do respect that has shifted. But I think that's also down to what people's expectations are around their kind of total reward package, rather than it being, you know, it's not a pension for life anymore. And I think that's where some of the shifts happened. Yeah. Perhaps.
So, and actually, as you were talking there, one of the people listening, Will, has said that he's an Ajax fan. And as a Spurs fan, I've got to apologise, because I imagine that was a rough day a couple of years ago. But we,
the Brighton fan, it's always rough.
Always rough in Brighton. Yeah. But it's he's saying he's not been to the stadium for 30 years, but it still feels as connected, as passionate, as emotional about the club as most people do. But I guess you'll get varying degrees of that as well. You sort of talk about different types of fans, don't you? Some that are there every week in, week out, those that are armchair supporters, as they'd be called, and some that are just digital. You know, there's a lot of aggro on Twitter that happens, and it's tribal for the sake of being tribal sometimes. So there's degrees of it. Now, Chris, you were shaking your head. It was quite a while ago. I think it was when I was asking Dan about personalization and whether we had to accept that there's a place for personalization that's your bubble, and then a place that's not going to be personalized in the corporate bubble, let's put it. But I suspect you're shaking your head at your disappointment that I was trying to drag us down two bookends again and saying it's either or, as opposed to this sort of blend, I suppose, that you're going to advocate.
One of these days, Mr. Moriarty. But I want to build upon what you've been chatting to Megan about, because I think it's a very important point in that, the last 5 minutes, we've been talking about culture, people, behaviors, working practices. Now, why is all of that stuff relevant for people who are interested in real estate, leases, corporate real estate, facility management, design, construction management? Never before have those factors had such a fundamental bearing, because we're fixated with space and with place and location. And, whereas we're only beginning, most of us have to understand, the nature of work and how it gets done and how it's rapidly changing, and also about people and their attitudes and behaviors and their feelings. Because I don't think too many people have made the connection that if you don't understand those, you're putting yourself at risk, because all of them have a fundamental impact on the demand and use and consumption of commercial real estate. And the biggest question that came out of the lockdown was people around the world, and it was headlined in the New York Times, to the FT, to the Economist. The question was, why should I commute downtown just to send emails? And we talk about hybrid and whatever. I would urge anyone involved in this conversation to take a look at what Standard Chartered Bank are doing with their differentiated workplace. Twice the experience and half the cost. And to listen to their leaders, Tanuja, their chief HR officer, and their CEO, who talks about the need to listen to their employees continuously, really engage with them. Don't be the aloof corporate titans that is atypical of the financial services world, and really understand how people feel about things. Because the one word we haven't used today is fear. We're in pandemic times for the foreseeable future. Hopefully the worst is behind us, but we don't really know that. And that brings about huge uncertainty. But Bill, I think Waters from Standard Chartered talked about, why do we need to have meetings for box ticking? Meeting people now is such a valuable experience, you should make the most of it. So that's bringing about a very, very big change in attitudes. And if an employer of 80, 90,000 people is thinking like that, then I'm sure other organizations will follow in their footsteps. So this is big. This has got huge implications for the world of real estate and workplace. It has huge implications for how spaces are managed, designed, let, and the whole 9 yards. And that's why understanding the link between people and place is so important. And we've got to stop talking about band-aid solutions to an existing system, which actually, if you look at it, is fundamentally obsolete because it doesn't cater for the needs of the modern day organization.
So I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Chris, because there's something I want to pick something up there. But Dan, I'm just going to pop to you very quickly, because what Chris is talking about there, about this need to meet and don't waste that opportunity and all the rest of it. Have you seen, and I know we're kind of getting it to almost like a scheme design level here, which is kind of counter to what Chris is just saying, like, let's not obsess with the space and think about the nature of work. But have you seen organizations do what we've been reading about, which is this shift to say, look, when we do bring people together, let's do meaningful stuff together. Let's, and does that influence some of the briefs that you get to say, look, we really want collaboration to sit at the heart of this, as opposed to what Anthony Slumbers would describe as a spreadsheet office of just rows of desks. Have you seen people get that now? Have you seen people really embrace it?
Oh yeah, totally. Across the board, everyone we've been working with past couple of years, think about the experience, like say, no, I've never heard that term, spreadsheet office. But yes, so trying to change that vision away from what you imagine in your head as a boring office, rows of desks, and heightening the experience, and as you say, making the most of those meeting opportunities. So yes, a lot of firms are slightly downsizing, but it depends on what you had in the first place if you're going to redesign your office. But even those that are downsizing, the collaboration and meeting spaces are getting much more, are increasing, sorry. So that balance of space, the percentage of those spaces is now massively on the rise, and the percentage of spaces for doing solo long-term work for like 3 or 4 hours in a row is decreasing as people are doing it more at home. But then there are also firms that aren't downsizing whatsoever. They're actually taking more office space and making a massive thing about it. So just having much greater social spaces. So when people do come together, they come together in a really well-designed, good space, whether it's cafe, restaurant, whatever, and really good meeting spaces for both clients and internal meetings as well. And just really making it, a wow experience of coming in. So hopefully that then you leave the office at the end of the day thinking, wow, I'm really glad I got on the train this morning to come in, because all these things happened. They happened in an amazing space. And obviously then that ties back in again to company culture. You feel like you're being thought about. So yeah, it's encouraging that not all companies are just saying, right, let's cut our space in half. Yeah. Even the ones that are thinking that way are also changing the design, so it's better for people when they do use it.
It's I saw someone from LinkedIn say something similar actually, where she was sort of advocating, don't just cut your space, actually keep the space you've got, because the stuff you actually need is the more space hungry spaces now, isn't it? The collaboration space is going to be less efficient, with it not wanting to disappear down the efficient train, but less efficient than rows and rows of people. So if you cut the space and then cram people in and then try and get them to collaborate, then you're going to get into all sorts of bother. Whereas actually just use the space you've got in a slightly different way. Just as we're coming to the end, I talked to the guys at OpenSensors. I said I'm gonna have one controversial question each webinar, and I've got my controversial question chip to use. And Chris, no surprises are going to come to you, because you touched on this obsession with space, and actually how we need to think differently and more broadly. And you touched on corporate real estate being in for a shock. In terms of the market, in terms of the big players around corporate real estate, how much of a change do you think is coming, and how ready do you think they are for it?
It's happening. It's not coming. It's happening.
Yeah.
And to take Dan's point, yes, people are making more intensive use of some of their buildings, but any smart head of real estate or workplace will be saying, let's focus upon the really useful stuff and let's see what we can do to reduce our footprint. I think footprints overall will be reduced between 20 and 40%. I think there's going to be a big demand when you look at it in terms of climate change. By 2030, all offices in downtown Manhattan have to be compliant with the guidelines set by the city council, which is either going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars to retrofit, or they're going to face a similar amount in fines levied by the city. So, the whole world of property investment, property leasing, property management, which is full of medieval-driven constructs, is wide open to large-scale disruption. And I think that disruption will come from the outside, where people will see a huge opportunity to come in and give enterprises the elastic space, as some people have described it, that enables them to get the best out of their workforces any place, anywhere, anytime. It's not to say that many of the long-standing models will disappear, but they're going to have to change, and change dramatically. We're really going to have to take into account that digital transformation is here, and it's only ramping up. We haven't had the time today to discuss the impacts of automation and AI, which is going to take a lot of the last elements of process work out of the office function, which will have its own impact on the overarching demand. And people don't want to talk about this, but I've decided I would speak out for it, because somebody's got to point the finger that we have the opportunity now to view this as a challenge or an opportunity. We really need to think about this in a better, more smarter, more sustainable manner, and not worry about the fact that we might lose out on an income flow which has served us well for years, but to explore new horizons and new frontiers.
And what a lovely way to finish today's episode. So Look, thank you guys for all your inputs there. Very rich insights. So, and thanks for everyone that joined us. Sorry for the slight technical hitch earlier on, but we recovered well, I think, and remained agile and saw it as an opportunity to get back into the conversation as quickly as possible. So, look, thank you for everyone for taking part. I guess that in summary, what we're saying is change is upon us, and that message there from Chris at the end, it's an opportunity if we bear in mind some of the lessons that Dan's learned from the organisations he's talking to in terms of thinking differently, and just looking at culture from Megan. I'm getting a sense of looking at culture with a slightly different lens, actually thinking about it in a slightly different way, and not being bound to kind of old ideas shaping what our future is going to look like, which I think is kind of the overall theme of today. So look, thanks for joining us. This is the first in a series of webinars on this. Our next episode will look at practicality. So we're going to be joined by 3 workplace leaders who are doing this live. They are currently in their organizations wrestling with some of these challenges. So it'll be a very practical, very hands-on, and I know a very honest appraisal of how it's going and some of the challenges that they're facing. So to register for that, you need to go to the OpenSensors website. You'll also see some stuff there, some additional resources that they've produced. But for now, that's everything. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.